This week, we begin our reading of Pat Barker's Regeneration. This is a novel written in the 1990s, so contemporary to us rather than to the Great War itself. We are reading the first of a prize-winning trilogy. The other two books are The Eye in the Door and Ghost Road. Regeneration focuses on the treatment of shell-shocked soldiers at Craiglockhart War Hospital outside Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1917. This was a significant time for the hospital because two important poets of the First World War, Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, were both patients there at the time. Owen had been sent to the hospital because of nervous symptoms resulting from some horrific experiences at the front. Sassoon had been sent because he had grown to believe that the war was being unnecessarily prolonged, that neither side was likely to win, and that the waste of human lives, financial assets, and materials was unconscionable, and he was willing to say so. For the Army, declaring him out of his mind was better than court-martialing him, with all the attendant publicity. Sassoon was a highly decorated soldier and well-connected in English society. Regeneration uses a combination of real facts and reminiscences from the Great War, alongside invented scenes and characters. Owen, Sassoon, and Rivers are all real people, who lived and worked and left documentary evidence of their thoughts and feelings in the form of letters, memoirs, and literary works. When Rivers hands a sample of his handwriting to Billy Pryor, and Pryor agrees that it is essentially illegible, that's because Barker had spent time in archives, as I have, trying to make out Rivers's scrawl. The way Barker uses real things in the novel is pretty interesting. Owen, for instance, left tons of written material, and his letters to his mother and brother provide many of the details Barker uses. But the novel is organized around Rivers and his patients, and Owen was a patient of Dr. Brock, so he has no occasion to reveal his experiences in the novel. Instead, the invented character, Billy Pryor, voices some of Owen's experiences. Another source for Pryor is Edmund Blunden's memoir, Undertones of War. Structurally, the book is more modern than a World War I novel could be. Memoirs, of course, tell the experiences of a single person, and even novels like All Quiet on the Western Front are focalized through a single consciousness. But in a technique we are accustomed to in late 20th century writing, Barker shifts the focalization of the novel between a small set of central characters, Rivers, Sassoon, and Pryor. She also introduces a character, Sarah, who can show something of what women's lives and concerns were during the war. Of course, no war memoir of the time would focus on treatment at a mental hospital. The standard war memoir instead isolates scenes of battle and military life. Even Sassoon's memoir, which does mention his time at Dottyville, skips over the events of his time there, mentioning only the good golfing that is available in Scotland and praising Rivers's intelligence and wisdom. But Regeneration challenges the typical war memoir even more by thinking about the effects of the war on those at home, considering the lives of women munitions workers, all members of the working class, and contemplating problems like the class relations of early 20th century England and how those were stressed and altered by the pressures of the war. Barker said in an interview that she made a conscious choice to write dialogue using more contemporary English rather than trying to stay authentically true to the discourse of 1917. Language hasn't changed much in 100 years, but it's certainly the case that we are much less formal than people were back then. Her feeling was that writing dialogue that is truer to 1917 would create an artificial barrier for her readers. The point of the book is not to say, look how weird our great-grandparents' language was, but to explore how the war affected soldiers and the people in society who made the war effort possible. Because Regeneration is set at a hospital rather than in the trenches, it partakes in a tradition of women's writing about the war, which, because women could not fight in the trenches, focuses often on more adjacent locations, primarily hospitals. During the war, Large numbers of women, including women whose class status would ordinarily have precluded them from working, went to work in hospitals, munitions factories, even in cafes catering to soldiers. These experiences generated some important women's war memoirs, such as Vera Britton's Testament of Youth or Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone. Barker has chosen not to feature a woman hospital worker, though such a story would have allowed her to use the best-known women's writing about the war. Instead, she writes a story that hasn't been told directly, the story of a young woman who works in a munitions factory. Many, many women worked in such factories during the war, the original Rosie the Riveters. But inequalities in how boys and girls were educated meant that writing was something most working-class women wouldn't think of as a way to transmit their experiences. Barker is very interested in how differences in class status or gender affect things like education and nutrition, things that have a material effect on people's lives. Billy Pryor, for instance, talks about the large numbers of men from his neighborhood who were rejected by the Army because of poor physical condition, a result of poor nutrition in childhood. Many Americans don't remember that our school lunch program was begun as a national security measure at a time when economic conditions were drawing people from farms to cities. Just as in England, American workers who dwelt in cities often could not afford adequate nutritious food for their children, and lawmakers feared that this would create the same problem England had, large numbers of potential soldiers who could not be enlisted due to their small size. England's official size cutoff was 5'3" during the Great War. Later, they added bantam battalions that accepted men who were below that height, but at least 5 feet tall. Even so, a substantial number of potential recruits had to be turned away from an army desperate for soldiers. Let's look at some of the ways Barker uses historical texts to craft her story. If you look on page 63, you will see that Sassoon woke to the sound of screams and running footsteps. The screams stopped, and then a moment or two later started again. He peered at his watch and made out that it was 4:10. Upstairs, whoever it was screamed again. He heard women's voices, and then, a few minutes afterwards, a man's voice. Rivers, he thought, but he couldn't be sure. Quaking and comfortless, he propped himself up against the iron bedhead and waited for the dawn. We'll find out on the next page that Pryor is the one screaming, and that it is, indeed, Rivers going to his aid. The scene from Sassoon's point of view comes from his poem To a Very Wise Man, written about Rivers. Let's look at the middle stanza. In a strange house I woke, heard overhead hastily thudding feet and a muffled scream. Is death like that? I quaked, uncomforted, striving to frame tomorrow in a dream of woods and sliding pools and cloudless day. You know how bees come into a twilight room from dazzling afternoon, then sail away out of the curtained gloom. The scene is obviously the same. Barker read this poem while researching the book and thought to herself, I'll have a scene where Sassoon is awakened by a fellow patient's screams. She signals in the passage that it derives from a real experience of Sassoon's by including some of his words, quaking and comfortless. Those words are unusual enough that readers might stop themselves and wonder if Barker is using a historical source here. The fictional element comes in adding to and filling out the scene from Sassoon's point of view, and of course in Barker's attribution of the screaming to a fictionalized Pryor. Barker uses many historical documents in similar ways throughout the book, but she also allows historical documents to interest her in people, who she then gets to know by imagining them for her novel. Rivers, for example, left a large number of mostly illegible manuscripts, as well as published books and essays, and he was a well-known and important figure in anthropology and psychology, so many other people also wrote about him. You can tell from the way Barker portrays him in Regeneration that she finds him a very sympathetic figure. Partly, this is because his methods are more modern than contemporary to his time. He believes in talking to and actually listening to his patients, whereas other doctors at the time thought their job was to wield authority over their patients. We'll meet an example of that kind of doctor in Part 4, when Rivers goes to visit a hospital treating shell-shocked enlisted men. The other reason Rivers appeals to Barker is because of the universal fondness his former patients and students had for him. That probably has something to do with why the book centers so strongly on the relatively unknown Rivers rather than the famous war poets Owen or Sassoon. Rivers believes, and Barker gets this straight from his writing, that the repressive way that boys are raised in his society has something to do with why men break down in wartime. Turn to page 48, and let's look at a passage where Rivers contemplates this problem. In leading his patients to understand that breakdown was nothing to be ashamed of, that horror and fear were inevitable responses to the trauma of war and were better acknowledged than suppressed, that feelings of tenderness for other men were natural and right, that tears were an acceptable and helpful part of grieving. He was setting himself against the whole tenor of their upbringing. They'd been trained to identify emotional repression as the essence of manliness. Men who broke down, or cried, or admitted to feeling fear were sissies, weaklings, failures, not men. And yet he himself was a product of the same system, even perhaps a rather extreme product. Certainly, the rigorous repression of emotion and desire had been the constant theme of his adult life. Let's see if we can pull that apart a bit to understand it better. First, we can see that Rivers's basic approach to psychological injury is very much what you would find in any modern PTSD clinic. Soldiers going for treatment today would also be assured that breakdown was nothing to be ashamed of, and that tears were an acceptable and helpful part of grieving. Rivers didn't have access to the pharmaceuticals that might be deployed today, but the basic standard of care for soldiers with PTSD focuses on getting them to talk through their experiences and own them, and on behavioral interventions to help patients cope, both techniques that form the basis of Rivers's treatment scheme. Second, as Elaine Showalter has noted, psychiatric treatment made a giant leap forward during the First World War because doctors had to notice a similarity between the masculine illness they called shell shock and a condition of women they called hysteria. In the Victorian era, doctors had used various treatments against hysteria, none of them very successful, and all of them based on forcing the patient to repress more vigorously her experiences. As Rivers notes here and in his essay, Repression of War Experience, repression creates the symptoms of shell shock rather than dissipating them. So the connection between the pre-war women's disease and the wartime men's condition enabled psychiatrists to understand the role of repression and to move toward more effective treatment schemes. Rivers had studied color perception in Germany shortly after completing his medical degree, and he had thus come into contact with Freud's theories, which were disdained in England because of Freud's belief that most psychiatric problems could be traced back to sex. Rivers made Freud's theories useful to British doctors by downplaying the sex angle and focusing instead on repression as a mind function that could have either helpful or unhelpful consequences. So, for instance, repression is what keeps people from saying, "Gosh, you're really stupid," to their bosses and losing their jobs. We couldn't really live together at all if we didn't have repression, and there are many comedies out there that use this understanding as the premise of their funny situation. There's a great episode of I Love Lucy that explores this. Lucy makes a bet that she can't go a day saying nothing but the whole truth. Hilarity ensues. But what Freud saw and Rivers popularized is that repression also underlies the neuroses. When a person is repressing too much or repressing too hard, that creates the energy that can come out as PTSD. In Regeneration, Rivers notes that expressing emotion, or even feeling emotion, has been forbidden to men in his culture. And so, fear, tenderness, these emotions were so despised that they could be admitted into consciousness only at the cost of redefining what it meant to be a man. If you flip over to page 107, you can see another version of this idea. Here, Rivers has just heard the story that horrifies Pryor so much he's unable to remember it. He is thinking about nurturing, and he says, he distrusted the implication that nurturing, even when done by a man, remains female, as if the ability were in some way borrowed or even stolen from women. Rivers had often been touched by the way in which young men, some of them not yet 20, spoke about feeling like fathers to their men, worrying about socks, boots, blisters, food, hot drinks, and that perpetually harried expression of theirs. Rivers had only ever seen that look in one other place, in the public wards of hospitals, on the faces of women who were bringing up large families on very low incomes, women who, in their early 30s, could easily be taken for 50 or more. The relationship between officers and their men is domestic, he notes, and forms of love and caring are part of that. In fact, militaries have known, probably for as long as there have been armies, that these bonds of devotion between soldiers and officers in a unit are essential for maintaining a fighting force. These are the bonds soldiers rely on to know that their comrades have their back in a firefight, that they are there to help and support one another. It enables individual self-sacrifice in service of group well-being, such as when one soldier throws himself on a hand grenade to save his comrades. Barker has Rivers think of this as a maternal or feminine connection because of the way Rivers' society can't imagine nurturing and caring as other than essentially feminine. But because Barker is writing as something more like our time than like Rivers's, she can also have him question the logic of this. If men aren't equally capable of caring and nurturing, then there was really very little hope for humanity. As you read Regeneration, be alert for moments like this that highlight the cultural shift we've experienced since the Great War. Barker is partly trying to understand her grandparents' time and partly trying to understand our own. How did we come from a time when nearly every man rigorously repressed his tenderest emotions, to a time when we expect that all men want to embrace their full humanity? What does this shift mean for men, for women, and for society as a whole? How does this shift affect our thinking about war itself?